Hello, thank you for joining us today, and welcome to today's webinar by ESHA Research. My name is Ben Miller, as always joined by Elise Triplett and Stephanie Ulrich, and today's topic is going to be an update on added sugars. Do a little background before we get into the actual topic. ESHA Research was established in 1981. It's one of the very first nutrition software solutions. Today we have Genesis R&D Food, which is probably our kind of primary topic today, Genesis R&D Supplements, food processor, consulting services. Genesis was released in 1991, and like I said, that will be our primary focus today. Genesis is designed for product development, formula analysis, menu analysis, reporting, regulatory compliance, and much, much more. We have a couple upcoming webinars, as you can see. We have an update similar to what we're going to do today with added sugars on dietary fiber on March 12th. And then on April 24th, we're going to have one working with recipes in Genesis, similar to what we did with our last one when we were working with ingredients. If you'd like to register for any of our webinars, you can find that on our website or view any of our archived webinars we've done in the past, including this one later today. Please note, as always, this webinar is being recorded. All of our webinars are available on our website, like I mentioned, and please submit your questions in the control panel as we go. We have people that are going to be answering questions along the way. So if you have a question, feel free to throw it out there as soon as you can, and we'll answer that as we go. If we don't get to your question, we'll certainly follow up afterwards. What we're going to cover today, added sugars, a review on that, what's considered an added sugar and what is not, quantitative and DV declaration, guidance documents, Farm Bill, user tips for compliance, best practices for documentation, and some Q&A afterwards. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Alicia. She's going to guide us through that topic.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, today we'll try and get caught up to speed on where we sit at this point in time with the labeling of added sugars. This continues to be an evolving topic, so I'm sure we're going to have more to discuss at a later date. But as a brief overview of added sugars, let's revisit definitions, daily values, and a few other aspects of labeling. With the 2016 FDA final rule for food labeling, added sugars was included as one of the mandatory label nutrients. Added sugars is listed indented under total sugars on the U.S. label with the quantitative amount and percent DV listed. The regulations also include options to state added sugars as less than and as insignificant when amounts per serving qualify to do so. The percent DV on the label is calculated from the daily value recommendation of 50 grams. And this was arrived at in line with discussions in the Dietary Guidelines for Americans that intake of added sugars should be less than 10% of overall calorie intake. So if you start with the general 2,000 calories a day recommendation that we use for labeling, apply 449 where we get 4 calories per gram of sugar, which is a carbohydrate. We see the recommendation to limit added sugars intake to 50 grams a day. The Dietary Guidelines for Americas also stress the importance of following healthy eating patterns that contain nutrient-dense foods and limit empty calories. With too many empty calorie foods, we might reach our suggested calories level before we've consumed the beneficial balance of components like protein, fat, fiber, vitamins, and minerals that we need in order to grow, maintain, and thrive. Added sugars was added to the nutrition facts label to help identify where foods land on the nutrient-dense versus empty calorie scale. And here you can see examples of whole foods that contain all naturally occurring sugars as part of the complete nutrient profile of the food, as well as sugar ingredients like white sugar and honey, whose sugars are considered added sugars, and also foods that contain a combination of the two. And it's this middle section that we might need the most attention with regards to declaration of added sugars. The 2016 food labeling final rule states the definition that added sugars are either added during the processing of foods or are packaged as such, and include sugars-free mono and disaccharides that are from syrups. They include honey, sugars from concentrated fruit or vegetable juices, that are in excess of what would be expected from the same volume of 100% fruit and vegetable juice of the same type. Examples of these sugars include white sugar, brown sugar, and other forms of sugar known by various sugar names, and mono and disaccharide names like dextrose, fructose, and lactose. It includes honey, molasses, syrups like corn syrups, malt syrup, and maple syrup, and again, juice concentrates in some applications. This is certainly not an exhaustive list. These are just some examples. I mentioned lactose. Lactose is the sugar from milk. Lactose is present in milk products as a naturally occurring sugar. The sugars in whole food dairy products like milk or in milk powder are not considered added sugars. They come with the full nutrient profile of the milk product. However, lactose as an isolated sugar has a standard of identity that's stated in the CFR. You can see the reference there. An ingredient that meets the standard of identity for lactose also meets the FDA definition of added sugars, so it needs to be labeled as such. FDA guidance that was first published in January 2017 and updated in November 2018 speaks to the FDA's views on certain aspects of added sugars and presents multiple examples for calculating added sugars from juice concentrates and provides much more technical detail on bricks, hydrolysis, and fermentation. We also have a separate webinar that discusses these topics from a more technical approach. So I invite you to take a look at these resources for more instruction. You can find the archived webinar on the ESHA website, and we'll include a link to the guidance and that webinar in the follow-up email to today's session. We also have a series of cheat sheets available on the ESHA website. This is the sheet for added sugars. This provides at a glance the information we are talking about today. Note the declarations allowed for added sugars. If your product contains less than 1 gram of added sugars per serving, you can show less than 1 gram on the label, or you could include an insignificant footnote. If your product contains less than 0.5 grams of added sugars per serving, this can be expressed as 0 or insignificant. And Genesis includes the various rounding and statement options in the label settings. And note the section on items that need special consideration. Again, that speaks to juice concentrates, purees, and fermentation, and those topics are covered in the guidance and the webinar that I mentioned. So to discuss declaring minimal amounts of added sugars a bit more, what if your finished product contains a small amount of sugar that would report as 0 on your label, but you need to declare the sugars by name in the ingredient list? So we've heard concern for misleading or confusing consumers by stating 0 added sugars when clearly the product contains sugar ingredients. It is compliant to declare zeros on the label and still list sugars in the ingredient list. But in general, if you want to carefully consider the consistency of any information that you present on your labels. Perhaps in this case, use of the insignificant statement would be helpful, or perhaps providing a statement about added sugars on your product website FAQ might be helpful to consumers. The new labels have been appearing on many products already, but the idea and the reporting of added sugars is still relatively new to many. There's certainly an educational element that can be provided by manufacturers to help consumers along. And also from an ingredient perspective, remember that minimal amounts of added sugars can add up as you formulate. So when you're working with ingredients in Genesis, it's most helpful to obtain data sheets from your suppliers that report ingredients per 100 grams as unrounded data so that you can track as much detail as possible on the added sugars content. As I mentioned, the labeling of added sugars has been evolving. And in February 2018, the FDA provided draft guidance specifically regarding declarations that can be made about added sugars contained in pure honey, pure maple syrup, and certain cranberry products. A dagger or obelisk symbol within the label and a factual statement outside of the label could be used to further explain the added sugars present in these products and to comment on the purity of these products. The symbol option is included in Genesis at this time, and today we're showing Genesis version 11.6. With that being said, in June 2018, the FDA released a statement that further review would be occurring on this matter, and in September 2018, a statement was issued alluding to the reporting of added sugars as 0 for single ingredient sugars, but perhaps still reporting a %dB. So you can trace the thoughts of declaring added sugars and the challenges in finding the right balance in doing so. And that brings us to December 2018 and the signing of the House Resolution 2, also known as the Farm Bill or the Agriculture Improvement Act of 2018. That includes the following statement in Section 125.16. Labeling exemption for single ingredient foods and products. The food labeling requirements under Section 403 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act shall not require that the nutrition facts label of any single ingredient sugar, honey, agave, or syrup, including maple syrup, that is packaged and offered for sale as a single ingredient food bear the declaration includes so many grams of added sugars. So this refers to the packaging of these sugar ingredients, like a bag of sugar, a jar of honey, a bottle of pure maple syrup, etc. The Farm Bill bypasses the typical channels in which the FDA regulations flow and are communicated. So this statement is in effect, and of course manufacturers want to move ahead with it. But we've heard confusion expressed and a few different interpretations from industry on how the exact formatting of the nutrition facts label should appear. And we would look to FDA guidance to clear this up for all of us. There are a few other questions that have come up, what we would typically see or consider as a single ingredient sugar, but maybe contains very minimal other ingredients. So again, we look to FDA guidance to help clear some of these questions up for us and the formatting issues. We need to see direction regarding the portions of the statement shall not require that the nutrition facts label bear the declaration includes X grams of added sugars. And one interpretation that we've heard is the complete omission of added sugars line from the label. So added sugars not showing up on the label at all. And another interpretation has been retaining the added sugars line on the label, but listing the quantitative value as 0 grams and the %dB as 0. So you can appreciate the need for clarification here. And one more note regarding the symbol used on honey, pure maple syrup, and cranberry products. When that option was introduced in FDA guidance, remember that the FDA stated that they will use enforcement discretion with regards to the symbols and the statements on packages of these products. So if you already labeled your product with that understanding, those do remain supported by guidance. But we do look forward to seeing official FDA guidance regarding the single sugar ingredients. And if the label format changes are needed, Genesis will be updated as quickly as possible to accommodate those. So stay tuned on this matter and be sure that you're reading the ESHA blog posts and the newsletters and using the current software. Per the regulations, when manufacturers have a combination of naturally occurring and added sugars in products, the manufacturer must make and keep records of the added sugars added to the foods or that occur in the processing of the foods. One lab test cannot differentiate between the content of total versus added sugars, so careful documentation is necessary. With your ingredient records, look to see that your suppliers are reporting added sugars. Populate that information in Genesis when you are adding or updating ingredients. The added sugars value can be the same or less than total sugars. Added sugars should not be reported higher than total sugars on a data sheet and certainly not on a label. So if you see added sugars reported as higher than total sugars, you want to contact your supplier. For single ingredient items that meet the FDA definition of added sugars, like white sugar, brown sugar, honey, molasses, agave syrup, corn syrup, if an added sugars value is not reported, then you could assume that the added sugars value would be equal to the total sugars value reported, and you could enter that into Genesis. But just let me stress here, regardless of the requirement of declaration of these single ingredient sugars, once you have added one or more of these type of ingredients that meet the FDA definition of added sugars to a formula, the sugars contained in those ingredients count as added sugars, and those must be declared as such on the finished product label. If added sugars is not reported on your supplier information and the ingredient is a mixed food containing some added sugars ingredients, contact your supplier for more detail. That ingredient may need to head back up the informational supply chain to fill in the missing values. So your supplier may need to contact their supplier to help fill in the blanks. In Genesis, the total sugars field and the added sugars field are separate fields. Genesis will not automatically calculate added sugars, as this is a human determination. So you must manually populate the added sugars field. And one of the essential reports in Genesis is the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet shows you the nutrient detail of each ingredient in your recipe. If an ingredient is missing data, such as for added sugars, this is indicated on the spreadsheet by dashes, as you can see here. It's very important that you fill in the blanks for your ingredient data, especially for the label nutrients. In this case, the dried sweetened cranberries are missing added sugars data. As the name of this ingredient indicates, we might expect to see some added sugars reported for this product. So once you obtain the nutrient data you need, you want to update the individual ingredient record. So open the ingredient record in Genesis, enter the data that you found. Here it would be to populate the added sugars data for the dried sweetened cranberries. And then that ingredient records data will carry forward to any recipes that you've used that ingredient in. And then your label will report complete and accurate data. We here at ESHA provide as many resources and we help as much as we can when it comes to labeling. And Ben will tell you more about how to best get a hold of us. But I also wanted to leave you with a link to the FDA Industry Resources page where you can find guidance, references, and a way to submit questions directly to the FDA. FDA personnel have mentioned that if they see themes of questions from industry, then they will try to address those in a way that is helpful to as many folks as possible. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ben to show you a few of the settings and features in Genesis.
All right, so let's switch over into the Genesis software. And we'll go ahead and open up an ingredient and then open up a recipe and just take a look at some of those fields that Alicia talked about. So I'm going to open up an ingredient. I'm just going to look for white sugar. Open that item up. So the first thing that we're going to want to look at is the nutrients tab inside of Genesis. And that's going to be looking for, as Alicia mentioned, if you're looking to add in the added sugars value to a ingredient that maybe doesn't have the value in it, you want to add it into that nutrients tab there. One thing to note, and I'll point this out again once we get to the recipe, if you don't see added sugars in this window, it's most likely due to your nutrients to view. There's two ways around that. You can either click the show all nutrients box here, let's check that, and it's going to show all of the nutrients in the entire program instead of just the ones in nutrients to view. We have added sugars and total sugars. Or in this case, I have both of them shown right now because I'm showing the correct set of nutrients. But if I didn't, we go to the home tab and nutrients to view. We now see I have mandatory nutrients for US label 2016 selected. If you had the mandatory US label selected here, it would not have added sugars because that's going to be the 1990 regulations. So if you're using that set of nutrients, you want to switch over into the 2016 to be able to see added sugars, or modify the list you currently have so you can see a customized set of nutrients that you would like to view. Maybe it's going to have the mandatory nutrients for 2016 and 1990, so you can see all of those at the same time. At that point, it's completely your choice of what you would like to view. And then Alicia mentioned a little bit of the documentation for your Genesis system and for your items. And a lot of that's going to come down to the notes fields. You have notes 1, 2, and 3 at the bottom. So you can write in some notes on when you got data, when things were declared, things like that. And then also attachments. So if you needed to attach a spec sheet from a supplier for updated data, for getting added sugar data, whatever else it might be, attaching those files, whether they're PDFs or Word documents or anything else, spreadsheet, attaching that in gives you great documentation and historical changes. And you can also enable the audit trails feature. That way, when you save an item and update it, you can maybe make some notes then as well. We talked about audit trails earlier. If you want some additional information on enabling audit trails, you can certainly contact us afterwards. And then going towards a recipe, go ahead and open an existing recipe, my chopped salad recipe. For a recipe, again, the biggest thing that Alicia mentioned was that spreadsheet report. The spreadsheet report is going to show you all of the nutritional information for your ingredients and for the recipes totals. And in this case, I changed it over to the 1990 regulations. So on my spreadsheet, I'm not going to see added sugars, but again, going back over, changing that over to 2016, can now see the totals for all these. And you can see I've got a lot of missing values for added sugars in my recipe because I have a lot of items and maybe just haven't had that data added in either from a user ingredient or maybe an ESHA ingredient that hasn't gotten that data from said supplier. All right, now, if you have any questions, if there's anything you feel like you need some more information on, we always have trainings that are available for Genesis. Our next training at our Oak Brook, Illinois ESHA training facility. It's going to be an advanced Genesis workshop on March 13th to 14th. And then we have a professional Genesis training, restaurant menu label training, June 19th and 20th, also in Illinois at our training facility. If you'd like to take a look at our full schedule or sign up for any of those trainings, you can find those on our website. We're going to get into a few questions. Before we do, if we don't get to your question, reach out to us. If you have a question about your account, your program, switching over into the cloud instead of having installed software, anything like that, always reach out to our sales team. Or if you have any questions about added sugars, technical support, any of those sorts of things, reach out to our support team. And you can always read a lot of fantastic information on our blog, e-newsletter, e-learning center, all of those sorts of places too. So with that, we're going to go and get into a couple of questions. Our first one, are dried fruits considered added sugars?
The FDA guidance speaks to this in detail, but briefly, sugars from dried whole fruit or dried fruit pieces are not considered added sugars because, again, they contain that full nutrient profile that we were talking about. It comes with additional nutrients and components in the whole food, so those would not be considered added sugars. The guidance talks about pulps, pastes, purees, and other type ingredients. So again, I'll refer you to that guidance. And just a note on dried fruits, we often see sweetened dried fruits. So if you have a sweetened dried fruit that has sugar added, then any of the sugars that come from, say, the sweetener, that ingredient, the sugar ingredient that was added to the whole fruit, then just the sugars from the sweetener would be considered added sugars, but not the sugars that come naturally from that dried whole fruit.
Fantastic. Our next question, I get a premix from a supplier that contains sugar, but I don't add any other sugar ingredients to my finished product. Do I have to declare added sugars on my label?
Yes, you do. So even if you aren't adding any single ingredient sugars to your recipe and your processing, if you obtain a premix and that contains any of those sugar ingredients that meet the FDA definition of added sugars, then you need to report the added sugars from the premix and any other ingredients that contain added sugars. If the added sugars from the premix and other ingredients in your recipe add up to less than 1 gram or 0.5 grams per serving in your finished product, then you can declare those appropriately. So as less than 1 gram or 0. But if it's a declarable amount from any of the ingredients for added sugars, you must list those on your label.
Fantastic. Our next question, I've asked my supplier for added sugars data, but they're not reporting it yet. What can I do?
Keep asking. Everyone is in the same boat trying to update information as quickly and accurately as possible. And the compliance date for the 2016 label format for most U.S. labels is January 1st, 2020. And the FDA has stated that it looks at the date that a package was labeled when considering the compliance of the old versus the new label formats.
All right. What if I've already labeled my single ingredient sugar products and declare my added sugars the same as my total sugars?
Well, for one thing, thank you for being proactive and declaring that information. But the final rule for the 2016 labels has been effective since 2016. So it's completely reasonable that many manufacturers have moved forward with the new label formats. Again, the date that the package was labeled is considered when it comes to compliance. It would also be reasonable as part of your documentation to record the rules or the rule that were in effect at the time your product was labeled. So you can also contact the FDA directly using the inquiry form that I mentioned and see if they can comment specifically. That's with any labeling issues. Feel free to contact the FDA directly, and hopefully we'll see specific responses to these kinds of questions in upcoming guidance. And just let me comment on items in the ESHA database. We will continue to report ingredients that meet the FDA definition of added sugars with their full added sugars values. This is because the common use of these items in the database would be to be used in recipes and not necessarily to be used for a single sugar ingredient label. So we treat those ingredients in the ESHA database as added sugars for that purpose.
All right. Next question, what is the is sugar checkbox for in the ingredient record?
Oh, sure. The is sugar box is placed, it's in place to address Canada's approach to listing sugars. So this box pertains only to Canadian labeling features, and it allows you to mark ingredients that are defined as sugars based on Canadian law. Once you mark each sugar ingredient, those are grouped within the ingredient list when you're working with Canadian 2016 labels. Ben, do you want to show that in Genesis?
Sure, we can certainly get in there. So there's two places that you can view that. If I have a Canadian label for a recipe already, let's do Canada Nutrition Facts 2016. In the ingredient statement of the finished recipe itself, we've got the is sugar checkbox over here. Inside of the ingredient, you're going to see that in the ingredient statement field towards the bottom of that field, but we can see that here as well. And with our 2016 Canadian label, it's now grouping these up as sugars, parenthesis. The ingredients that are obviously tomato, celery, and parsley are not sugars. This is just purely for an example's sake. And so faking some information here, but you can see that whatever ingredients you have checked here are going to go into that statement inside of your ingredient statement. And like I said, inside of the ingredient, it's going to show that just in the ingredient statement window in that ingredient. And then it looks like we have enough time for a couple more questions. Would a sweetener need to declare added sugar?
Well, when you say sweetener, this term applies to caloric and non-caloric sweeteners. So sugars present in sweeteners would count towards added sugars, but not all sweet ingredients contain sugars. So clearly sweeteners like sugars, syrups, honey, molasses contain sugars that count as added sugars. Sugar alcohols do not count towards the total sugar declaration, so would not be considered added sugars, and they are listed separately on the label. You can list sugar alcohols, or you can even list individual sugar alcohols on the label, and we have a tutorial that can show you how to do that in Genesis. Sweeteners like sucralose, ACE-K, stevia-based, monk fruit-based, and other items need further consideration, and you want to check with your supplier for specific clarification on those ingredients. We've had several questions come in on specific ingredients, and for some of those we will just address. We'll probably need to do a little research, But again, contact your supplier for clarification. And you want to obtain 100-gram data rather than per serving information. Consider the serving size for a lot of these is like 4 grams or 8 grams. So you'd want to see the 100-gram data that would report full unrounded carbohydrate values, sugar values, and then any ingredients that might contribute to added sugars. And again, with a lot of these sweeteners, those that are in lower calorie sweeteners, consider that the product might contain ingredients whose sweetening factors come from components that are not considered sugars, but then the manufacturer may blend those with ingredients that do contain sugars. And so for those blends, any portion of that ingredient that is coming from a sugar or something that meets the definition, the FDA definition of added sugars, would need to be declared as such. And I'll throw in one more note on that topic to suppliers of sweetener ingredients. If you are a supplier of a sweetener type ingredient, be prepared to provide clear 100-gram information to your customers. We want to see the sugars content of the products in the context of the 2016 labels. So there's nutrient declaration, and then oftentimes suppliers will provide a note that just provides clarification with regards to the 2016 labels. As part of the record-keeping requirements that I mentioned, that part of the regulations, we need to be able to document, your clients need to be able to document the sugar content details of all the ingredients, and we look to you who know your product best for help in reporting information as accurately as possible. So I thank you for that.
Sounds like a very strong theme. It's documentation
Yes.
and unrounded nutritional value.
Yes, please.
Very strong theme. I think we have a couple more. If I add honey to a product such as yogurt, would it be considered added sugar?
So honey is one of those ingredients that are considered added sugars that meet the FDA definition. So yes, the honey contained in the yogurt would count as added sugar.
Okay. Did you want to take that top one there, Alicia?
Yeah, sure. So a couple specifics, trehalose as one of the added sugars, and yes, I believe that is on the FDA list. It's stated specifically in some of the guidance. So the CFR doesn't necessarily list all of the ingredients that are considered added sugars, but additional guidance lists a few more, and trehalose is one of those. And then maltodextrin has come up before. Is maltodextrin an added sugar or not? And the thing about maltodextrin is it's an ingredient that can contain sugars. Maltodextrin itself may not be considered an added sugar as part of that FDA definition, but maltodextrin can certainly contain sugars that would count as those extra calories or towards extra calories and be considered added sugars. So what you might see for a maltodextrin product might be per 100 grams of maltodextrin, it's containing, 10 grams of sugar. And so those sugars would be entered in Genesis as total sugar as well as added sugars. And then those will carry through to your recipes.
Perfect. And then one very last question. Do all of the ingredients from the USDA database that are in Genesis with the Genesis database have added sugars declared?
They do not. So just a note on that. So the USDA database was not necessarily developed with the idea of labeling. It's been around for quite some time. And so it's reliable, it's wonderful data, and so it's often used. But not all ingredients in the USDA database report total sugars. So therefore not all report added sugars. What we have done is, by the FDA definition, we've applied that definition to USDA foods. So what you'll see in the ESHA database is things like white granulated sugar, brown sugar. You'll see the total sugars value as well as the same added sugars value. For whole food items like fresh produce or our fruits, vegetables, grains that we can identify, where all of the sugars contained in that type of ingredient is naturally occurring and would not, no portion of it would meet the FDA definition of added sugars, you'll see a total sugars value for its naturally contained sugar content and then a value of 0 for added sugars. For mixed foods, we don't have ingredient lists, and At this point, with the SR database, the USDA hasn't reported added sugars as a nutrient. So it's really just hit or miss. It's a mix of added sugars values reported versus not. And again, we continue to update that as quickly and accurately as we can.
Perfect. As I mentioned before, if we didn't get to your question either in a group setting or individually, certainly feel free to reach back out to us and we'll answer those questions individually. Thank you for all joining us today and have a great day.